Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Jake Jacobs and welcome to part one of Mob Rule, Unmasking the Radical Left. I gotta tell you something, I'm quite excited to really get into the meat of my book, Mob Rule, Unmasking the Radical Left. I start out my book by talking about the path to hell being paved with good intentions and also the path to hell being paved with bad intentions. Let me explain what I mean. Look, we've been seeing now since May of this year, 2020, we've been seeing riots occurring in major cities across the country. And we've been seeing a lot of thousands and thousands of young kids with good intentions gathering and protesting across the country. But something that a lot of these young, naive people don't know is that the path to hell is also paved with bad intentions of organizations that are hell-bent on destroying our heavenly roots. And really, this is the emphasis, this is the premise of my book, Mob Rule. And I want to unfold that to you historically. Let's start out with my first chapter on Antifa. This group, Antifa, it's really a fascinating organization. In fact, it was Joe Biden. Remember during the presidential debates a while back when Joe Biden said that Antifa is an idea, it's not an organization. Look, old Sleepy Joe needs to actually get an education when it comes to Antifa and what Antifa is all about. So let us go back into history a little bit here. It's the 1920s, late 1920s in Germany. Germany, after World War I, was under a government called the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic was in very serious straits, historical straits. They had serious economic problems, severe depression, unemployment in the mid-late 1920s. And along in Weimar Republic came a number of political parties. Dozens and dozens of political parties on the landscape in Germany. One of the organizations was the German Socialist Party. It was headed by a man by the name of Ernst Thälmann. And Ernst Thälmann was a Stalinist. He was a Marxist. And he attacked a number of German political parties in this time period. There was the Central Party, there was the Catholic Center Party, there was the Social Democratic Party, there was the the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. And here's the bottom line thing I want to get across to you guys, is that in this time period in history, there were a number of various groups that were fighting for political power. Some of them were really legitimate democratic parties, but a number of them were illegitimate parties that wanted to use the democratic processes to destroy democracy. One of them was the actual German Socialist Party in the 1920s and 1930s. And the founder of this, or the head of this organization, I should say, Ernst Thälmann, he was the one who created an organization called Antifa, or anti-fascist organization. They were against the Nazis. Well, let me say something. Who the hell isn't against Nazis? We despise Nazis. We despise what National Socialism is all about. But what you need to recognize is that this organization, Antifa, its origin is Stalinistic, is Marxist, is another vicious, horrible, deplorable cosmology or political philosophy that was hell-bent on destroying what we would call our First Amendment rights of freedom of religion, speech, press, and assembly, and the right to peaceably assemble, I should say, and the right to petition our government. So what you saw in Germany in the late 20s and early 1930s was these two vile political philosophies fighting each other. In fact, Ernst Thälmann, the head of this political party, he was the one who said that all of his political opponents, whether they were Catholic centrists, whether it was the Social Democratic Party, he said all of his political opponents were fascist. So it was very fashionable back in the 1930s for the Marxists, for the Stalinists in Germany to call their opponents fascists. Does that sound familiar? In this day and age, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and many within the Democratic Party call their political opponents fascists. I mean, we got the Secretary of State of Arizona tweeting out that in 2017 that all of Donald Trump's followers were neo-fascist, or neo-Nazis, I should say, and Donald Trump himself was a Nazi. This kind of reductio ad Hitlerum argument goes way back in time, and it's very common for the hardcore left to actually attack and label its opponents as fascists, very fashionable, as Nazis. Very common in many cases. So my point is, historically, you see that Antifa's roots is actually very radical, very diabolical, and hell-bent on destroying our heavenly heritage in America. In fact, when you saw this happening in Minneapolis in May and June, a lot of the rioting going on in Minneapolis, you found that a Dartmouth historian by the name of Mark Bray had written a book called Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook. This guy was on Meet the Press. He was interviewed on C-SPAN, Teen Vogue magazine, who was actually having articles about how cool Karl Marx is, was having Bray on there telling us about Antifa and what they were all about and what a great group of people they were. And then you saw people like the gentleman who was the deputy chairman of the DNC by the name of Keith Ellison, the first Muslim in Congress, holding up a book of the Anti-Fascist Handbook and saying what a great book it was. And during these riots in Minneapolis, his son Jeremiah Ellison, who was in the Minneapolis City Council, tweeting out that Antifa was a great organization. Antifa is not a great organization. Antifa is not just an idea. It is an ideological worldview that wants to take action against our republic, against the very values that make this republic great. And it's something I cannot stress enough. And unfortunately, a lot of these young A lot of these young white suburban white kids who go off to the university, they get this Antifa ideology, balderdash, into their heads, and they start to go into the streets, and they believe, of course, that they have a righteous cause, and they're calling for revolution in the streets. In fact, happened to be one of my students from the academy where I teach, who now is about 23, 24 years old, is an alum. And he himself had brought a flamethrower and had a Molotov cocktail and some other military weapons that he was going to use to attack the police here in Wisconsin. And my point in bringing this up is that a lot of these young, naive kids, they go off to school, they're looking for a cause, and they find themselves what they think is a righteous cause, but in many cases it's an unrighteous cause, it's a militant cause, it's a violent cause, and they don't see that this organization, much more than an idea, is an idea that wants to destroy the very beauty of what makes our republic great. Once again, to reiterate, freedom of religion, speech, press, to peaceably assemble, and the right to petition your government. Antifa are the guys that they will go into the university and they love to disrupt speeches. They love to disrupt speeches. It might be the libertarian thinker Walter Williams, or it could be the brilliant speaker and thinker Ben Shapiro. These Antifa types will go to the University of Wisconsin. They'll go into Berkeley. They'll go into Brandeis. They'll go to universities across the country, and they will rudely interrupt these speeches. They will smash windows. They will come through, and they'll call the speakers. Many of these are conservative, libertarian, pro-life, lovers of our constitutional republic, and they'll scream that they're Nazis and they're fascists. Very typical of Antifa to do this. So it's really, I call Antifa Antifafa. They're anti-fascist fascists. And they live in an Orwellian world of perversion of language, and they'll use the language of democracy to destroy democracy. Remember, that's what Adolf Hitler used to always say: I will use democracy to destroy democracy. And this is the roots of Antifa, and I feel bad when I see so many young people falling for this false call of social justice, when in reality, these Antifa individuals are acting in fascist actions. Is there anything else about Antifa that I want to mention? By the way, I also think it's so hypocritical when it comes to organizations like Antifa and Black Lives Matter, where, remember how they were saying during the CCP virus, right, that we had to have social distancing, but all of a sudden, the virus doesn't know the difference between Antifa and Black Lives Matter, and hundreds of thousands of these crazy leftists are in the streets violating social distancing without their mask, and of course, magically, the virus does not understand that Antifa is just an idea, right? So I just find the hypocrisy abounds when it comes to these organizations. By the way, it's not a coincidence that Antifa and Marxism, as you know, communism, Marxism, what Frederick Engels called scientific socialism, is very much anti-Christian, anti-Judeo-Christian, anti-traditional values. And it's not a coincidence that they despise the Catholic Church, that they despise the evangelical and the Protestant Church. That they despise. In fact, I have here by a retired Pope Benedict XVI, Ratzinger, where he has written a book called Western Culture. Another excellent book by the libertarian Thomas Woods, where he talks about how the Catholic Church built Western civilization. Here's my point. What you find with Antifa and Black Lives Matter is they have a very anti-Western civilization worldview. They despise the great thinkers of Western civilization, the Platos and Aristotles, the Augustines, the Thomas Aquinas, the John Locke that gave us many of the great ideas that were utilized by Thomas Jefferson and the Founding Fathers to create the great Declaration of Independence that talks about the laws of nature and nature's God and says that our rights come from our Creator. And in the Declaration, where it says that our Creator is called the Supreme Judge of the world. Well, Antifa and Black Lives Matter, these hardcore radical leftists, their orientation is atheistic. They despise the Judeo-Christian, the Christian foundation of our nation. I have here a Bible that was given out to people like my father. My father, Joe Jacobs, fought in World War II at the age of 17. He left home and gave 3 years of his life to fight the Imperial Japanese. He was Roman Catholic, and he was given a Bible that it says here, the New Testament Roman Catholic version, that was published by the government, the federal government, in 1942, signed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, they had Protestant versions of this too. Here's my point in bringing this up. We know the Nazis are anti-Christian. Anybody knows that. We hate the Nazis, right? We despise National Socialism. But people don't recognize and realize the cosmology, the worldview, the Weltanschauung of the Marxists, the communists, the so-called scientific socialists, who despise that our nation believes in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and that we have a heavenly Father, our Father who art in heaven. Holy is thy name, that your kingdom will come down here on earth. This is something that very much was the foundation of the nation. Our founding fathers, they were profoundly working within a Judeo-Christian paradigm, reference point, premise. Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Quakers, Catholics, Lutherans, etc., etc. But you find these radical organizations that have captured the youth, have captured the millennials, and unfortunately some Zoomers have captured their minds to have them go into a very atheistic direction. And this is something I think these young people need to be aware of. So now what I'd like to do is actually take some time out and talk about Black Lives Matter specifically. I mentioned in Chapter 2 of my book, Mob Rule, about Black Lives Matter. And I have to admit, and I've been doing this now for about 3 or 4 or 5 years, going back to Ferguson, so we're talking, what is that, about 2014-ish, I have been exposing the ideological worldview of Black Lives Matter, and it hurts, I have to admit it hurts, but a number of my liberal friends have in essence, unfriended me, disavowed me, say that I'm, a fool for saying these things, but the truth must be spoken. Remember, we can have headlines of Time magazine that says his truth is dead, and recognize something, that the Black Lives Matter movement and Antifa are predicated upon a lie. In fact, I call them the Pravda of the United States today. Pravda was the Marxist newspaper coming out of Moscow, and Pravda is the Russian word for truth. And you and I know that they were nothing but lies upon lies upon lies. And what we see happening with Black Lives Matter, the organization and the leadership, is despicable and diabolical. And what gets me is you'll see the leaders of Black Lives Matter on the cover of Time magazine. Here is Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrice Cullors, the three co-founders of Black Lives Matter. And if you go into that says what, the 100 most influential people in Time magazine, you go in there and you see that they talk about the greatness of Black Lives Matter. And then you see a lot of individuals like Ibram Kendi, who's in there talking about, this is probably the #1 writer of the so-called anti-racist books that are out there right now, recommended and used to indoctrinate a lot of young people. And this Ibram Kendi, whose background is Marxist, called Amy Coney Barrett a white colonizer because she dared to adopt 2 black children out of Haiti and take them out of their black cultural context and put them into the evil racist nation of America. This is the kind of stuff. These individuals who are in Time magazine and eulogized as the great thinkers and leaders of America, we must make sure that our youth can understand the source, these very sinister sources who take history and truth and pervert it and invert it. So back to the 3 co-founders of Black Lives Matter. It's interesting because there was an interview done with Patrice Cullors, he is a professor at Morgan State University of Baltimore. His name was Dr. Jared Ball. And if you go into Jared Ball's website, you see that he has books on black Marxism. And we go back in the interview that Jared Ball had with one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter. I think Black Lives Matter is not happy that this has been found. It's on his website. It was their interview for a radio program, a TV radio program. And in this interview, Dr. Ball says, hey, look, Jalil Abdul Mantaqim, he wants to know about your ideological framework. Well, I think it's important to ask, who is Jalil Abdul Mantaqim? I had to work on pronouncing that word for a long time, that name, because that's a tough one for the doc. But let me just say this. Jalil Abdul Mantaqim was a member of the Black Panthers and also belonged to the Black Liberation Army. And as you know, both of those organizations are Marxists, and they despise our constitutional republic under God. Jalil Abdul killed 2 New York policemen, and has been spending about 40, 50 years, 40-some years, he's been spending it in prison. So Jalil's in prison. He's in contacting with this Dr. Ball, who's interviewing one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, and he says, Patrice, Jalil wants to know your ideological framework. Where are you guys coming from? You guys look like you might just be a discombobulated organization that has no framework. And she says, we actually do have an ideological framework. Alicia and I have been trained in Marxism. I expose that, and I get attacked as a racist, as a white supremacist, as a Nazi, as a fascist, over and over again. My fellow Americans, when you expose the darkness with the light of historical truth, get ready for it, because they will label you. They will attack you. It happens all the time. Now, I think it's interesting to note that during these George Floyd riots that were occurring over and over, from Minneapolis to Portland to Seattle to Milwaukee to all over the country, you saw it was happening in Los Angeles. Let's talk a little bit about the Black Lives Matter leadership in LA. Her name is Melina Abdullah. And Melina Abdullah is a professor at Cal State Los Angeles. And Melina Abdullah has a colleague by the name of Anthony Radcliffe. By the way, you can look any of this up to confirm this, right? And he is a member of Antifa. And he's a proud member of Antifa. I don't know now if he has scrubbed his logo, his Antifa logo, from his Twitter account, but I have done extensive research on this for my book and for many speeches I give to find out the ideological origin of these individuals. So here's the leader of Black Lives Matter in Los Angeles, and she, along with Patricia Cullors, right? By the way, they call themselves queer liberators, right? They love to call themselves, let me make sure I get that phrase right. Yeah. We are engaged comrades. We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure, and we want to dismantle cisgender privilege. And we are queer social justice activists. All of them talk this way. By the way, it reminds me of when Jesse Jackson went to Stanford back in, 1987, and they were yelling, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western civs, got to go. You have to follow me on this, because what I've been talking about, why I even bothered talking about when the Pope wrote the book on Western culture and how the Catholic Church built Western civilization, and then I mentioned World War II. You think it was a coincidence when Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt met in the Atlantic, and they got together and they sang "Onward, Christian Soldier," and they talked about the war to save Western or Christian civilization? Right now we're in a war to save Western and Christian civilization. And what you see is Antifa and Black Lives Matter leadership, they want to destroy Western civilization. They themselves in their website talk about the Western prescribed nuclear family. And by the way, the Western prescribed nuclear family, according to Roman Catholic Orthodoxy, Catechism, and the Evangelical or Protestant Catechism, is husband and wife, is Adam and Eve. And so if you go into the Black Lives Matter website, you see them constantly talking about, trans liberation, queer liberation, LGBT liberation, but they attack the white male. They attack the nuclear Christian family. That goes all the way back to Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, where he talks about destroying the Christian family, besides destroying private property. I don't know. I wonder sometimes if people really recognize and realize how diabolical this Karl Marx was and his scientific socialism is to the Christian family in American society and any society across the world. Remember, Marxism killed over 100 million people. And this is so important for us to recognize. Back to Melina Abdullah, the leader of Black Lives Matter in Los Angeles. They purposely attacked. They went into Beverly Hills. They went into the Fairfax district, which is a region that's highly Jewish population in Los Angeles. They knew exactly what they were doing. And when they went in there, they were graffitiing F Israel, F white capitalism. I repeat, F Israel, F white capitalism. Very typical of Black Lives Matter to attack capitalism. There's some profound stuff going on there, because if you're a Marxist organization, which they are, they're going to go for free enterprise, the free market, because they're advocates of state control of economic productivity and economic job situation. They also would spray paint genocide, that the founding fathers were committed genocide. And they also talk about this Melina Abdullah and Anthony Radcliffe. They talk about actually being supporting the Nation of Islam. And Louis Farrakhan, and many of you know Louis Farrakhan is a vicious anti-Semite. So it's not a coincidence, not only is BLM's leadership Marxist and anti-white cisgender male, right, and anti-Christian, but they're also pro-Islam, pro-Muslim, and anti-Israel. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That's why if you go on their website, they talk about, liberation of Palestine, They're over and over and over again. They declare this. And they call themselves in their websites comrade. Okay? By the way, when Fidel Castro died, actually, Opal Tometi, one of the other co-founders, I did research and found out on social media where there she was writing articles praising Fidel Castro as a great liberator. Are you kidding me? Fidel Castro was a tyrant. Fidel Castro was a lying Marxist who took over power in Cuba, and he, along with Che Guevara, they went after Catholics, and they killed Catholics. In fact, Che Guevara was called the butcher of La Habana prison. And he and Fidel Castro both killed hundreds and thousands of Catholics and Christians, and that's why so many Cubans left Cuba, came over to America, to live in the greatest country in the world, to be free. And little Cuba in Miami, and many, many came here to be free. I think it's interesting. The most horrible, egregious, deplorable, racist nation in the world, and yet millions of people are coming to this country to be free. Who are they trying to kid? This is absolutely bizarre. That's why so many Cubans are voting the Republican route, because they understand the lies of the Democratic Party, and especially when it comes to Marxism and communism. By the way, it's very interesting. The leader of Black Lives Matter in New York, his name is Hawk Newsom. Some of you might have seen this, where Hawk Newsom did an interview with Martha MacCallum during the summer, during this George Floyd rioting going on. What a lie, by the way, when CNN News and MSNBC and all these other news organizations, right, tell us that they were peaceful demonstrations. That's a bunch of hooey. That's a bunch of rubbish. It was full. 1,000 police were attacked. Black businesses were burnt to the ground. Blacks were killed, besides a number of whites. There was a mean, vicious, militant component, and a lot of young, naive, well-intended individuals were sucked up into that vacuum of militancy perpetuated by Antifa and Black Lives Matter. But back to Hawk Newsom. He's giving an interview with Martha MacCallum, and he says, you know, we've been trained. We got special military forces, and we've been trained like the Black Panthers in the Nation of Islam. Now, theoretically or supposedly, this Hawk Newsom is a Christian, and he's talking about the Nation of Islam and Black Panthers, a Marxist organization, and they're copying them and they're following them. And then he starts using Orwellian language in the interview. I cover this in my book, where he says, we're going to burn down the system, figuratively and literally. So when you ask him, what do you mean, figuratively or literally? He says, well, it could be maybe figuratively or it could be literally. Literally means literal. That is what he's thinking. In fact, he was just arrested a couple of days in New York when his organization in New York was going up against a bunch of Trump supporters. Keep your eyes on Hawk Newsom. The man is a liar. He'll say things like, oh, well, I don't condone, but nor do I condemn. All these organizations, the Democrats should have repudiated and attacked Antifa and Black Lives Matter. But Joe Biden wouldn't do it. In fact, Kamala Harris went so far as to advocate Black Lives Matter radicalness and saying that we can understand why they're rioting in the streets. I mean, when you stop and think of it, this Hawk Newsom called himself a black revolutionary, that Jesus was a revolutionary. Then you saw a lot of these Black Lives Matter saying that Jesus Christ himself, you know, he wasn't white and he was black, right? Jeremiah Wright used to talk about that stuff, Barack Obama's pastor. The fact of the matter is these ideas come from black liberation theology by some of the theologians like James Cone, who wrote The Black Church and Marxism and Black Theology and Black Power. And you see that a lot of their criticism is actually an expression of critical race theory and critical theory, which really, in essence, going back to the cultural Marxists, is a way to criticize all of American society so you can dismantle the Judeo-Christian foundation of the nation. I got to tell you something, guys. I think you can tell I'm riled up here when it comes to this. I have so much to say, and I appreciate the producer here, Mike and Michael, and helping us put this together. I'm trying to cram a lot in here because there is so much to say. We could do this for hours. Of course, I'd be stupid to say you should just might as well get the book and get the details on this, because I back all this with historical data, historical facts. And by the way, when I come back next time, I'll be talking about education in this nation. And when black conservatives like Larry Elders and Shelby Steele and Candace Owens, when they get attacked as Uncle Toms and Aunt Jemimas, there's a reason for that. They're speaking the truth, and they want to shut them up so they don't speak the truth. And we need to be able to get the truth out there. And when you recognize what's happening in education in this nation, when Project 1619 is in over 4,500 schools, Black Lives Matter at School curriculum is in thousands of schools, when the Howard Zinn Project is out there disseminating their lies, their Marxist lies, into our schools, it's a wonder why there's been an exodus leaving the government schools because of the perpetuation of so many lies. It's why I love organizations like Freedom Project, because they get it. They've been on the fine cutting edge of this stuff for 10 years now, getting out the truth that will set us free. So that's going to wrap up part 1 of Mob Rule, Unmasking the Radical Left. I'm Dr. Jake Jacobs, and we'll see you guys next time.